gestures or those positioning, all right, actually assure some key stakeholders within the political system that this is a guy they can actually, pledge their support, to win the election, that they wouldn't be like the previous Labour administration or Labour, leadership. Because you see, the Labour Party had been, grounded with a lot of, what do you call it, demonstrations, all right? That is, the unions are always demonstrating. They don't like, what do you call, market conditions, etc. They want big government, big government in schools, big government in hospitals. But that Britain had, kind of moved on because there had been new kind of aspirational Britain, young people who wanted to do better, who wanted to have, their own jobs, etc. So they didn't want this gridlock England, gridlock Britain, where every time there's demonstration here and there. So when Tony Blair actually demonstrated that kind of leadership, that he's prepared to work with the market, he's prepared to work with the capitalists, he's prepared to work with people who are industry players, then that, support actually came in handy to push him to actually win the election. So definitely he needed to show that, that positioning. I hope it's clear.
Yes, it is. I have another question.
Yeah.
If you look at the way they came into power and you bring it to our local setting, my question is, which of the governments that we have had in the Fourth Republic has had a similar approach to coming into power and acting in power for its first period, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think certainly Kufuor's, election into power in 2000 was very much like the New Labour, kind of architecture, and there's no surprising that, because obviously within that time, if you look at how Clinton came to power, how Tony Blair came to power, and of course how Kufuor came to power, there was that kind of new kind of politicking within the system. And I think the last time when we were actually discussing, I talked about the emergence of the third way, which was very much seated within Anthony Giddens' work of how, political systems are actually moving towards the center. So there was no need for political parties to be very dogmatic by actually holding on to their ideological self and to say that, yes, we are left of center or right of center, and therefore we hold on to that. Kufuor, for example, demonstrated a lot of left-leaning, postures, to the extent that when he talked about capitation, mass, transportation, and all those, NHIS, kind of policies, people thought that, well, this is a completely, left of center policies. How can a very, center-right party actually promise, a raft of social democratic, policies, very welfare-based policies? But of course, that was pragmatic. There was no way you could actually leave a country that did not have any capital base, any, private capital. And even those, who had private capital, because of, Jerry Rawlins's, era moving towards NDC 1 and NDC 2, most people have, one way or the other, moved capital flight. They've moved capital out of the country, whether for good or bad reasons, we can't tell. But people have starved the country with the needed capital that could actually make things work. So the only thing that Kufuor could do is to sort of promise, government interventions in a scale that is definitely beyond, a center-right, a political party. And so you could actually say that Kufuor's time was almost, characteristic of Tony Blair's era and that of, Clinton Democrat as well. Yeah, yeah. Any other point? Or we should continue? Okay. So let's move on to the next bit. Okay.
Died following a car accident in Paris.
On the morning of the last day of August, Britain woke to the news that Princess Diana was dead. Blair quickly grasped that a tidal wave of emotion was about to engulf Britain and that someone had to share.
Doc.
Yeah. Announced the Prime Minister was coming on to do his thing. The people everywhere, not just here in Britain, everywhere.
Yeah, there was no sound at a point.
Okay, but can you hear now?
She was the people's princess.
Yes.
Okay.
That's done.
Okay.
And that's how she will stay, how she will remain. He came on and said that, you know, she was the people's princess, and I turned to the person who I was with, and I said to him, he was a good friend of mine. I said to him, "Oh, I think that was way over the top." And I turned around to pay for the newspapers, and the newsagent was in tears, which probably explains why Tony Blair's Prime Minister, and I never will be.
Princess Di was very important because it went beyond the political. You know, here he was speaking for the nation almost for the first time, beyond his party role, speaking for the nation, and captured the moment in which people, I think, were grieving and were touched. After that moment, he was a leader of special standing.
4 months into his premiership, Tony Blair's antennae for the national mood were superb, and his talent for turning a crisis into an opportunity exceptional.
The role that normally belonged to the head of state had been taken over by Tony Blair, sovereign of national emotion. His personal poll ratings soared into the 80s. One of his pollsters quipped, "Even Saddam Hussein doesn't get that." The question now was, did he know what to do with that popularity?
When Tony Blair took centre stage at his first party conference as Prime Minister, his approval ratings were surging to record highs. But he did not have the entire nation at his feet. There was one massive exception: Gordon Brown.
You have to remember that for many years, Blair was number 2 to Brown. From when he became an MP in 83 through till almost to the point when he challenged for the leadership 11 years later. I mean, he was always talking about Brown as the thinker, Brown as the great political tactician, strategist, and he had always assumed that he would be number 2 to Brown.
And so had Brown. When Labour's leader John Smith died in 1994, Brown assumed Blair would defer to him in the contest that followed. Brown was furious that it was he who ended up having to withdraw.
Gordon Brown would be forever possessed by the belief that he had somehow been cheated out of the prize. Now he would use the force of his personality and the strength of his intellect to try to dominate Blair.
The Chancellor is incredibly tough and strong, and he simply wouldn't agree to things. So at meetings, the Chancellor would be physically almost exploding with rage, and the Prime Minister would behave as though this was an adolescent child who he was kindly dealing with untold patience. Again, it was a spectacle to witness. Amazing, really. When the Cabinet Committee started, Gordon brought his staff with him, and the staff sat around the table and joined in as though they were members of the government. And I understand the Prime Minister did a note that they were not to come, but every meeting they came.
So the Chancellor simply defied a direct instruction from the Prime Minister not to bring his advisers to these meetings.
The Prime Minister was defied every meeting.
Although commentators often referred to President Blair, in truth, the government was more like a dual monarchy. From a mixture of respect and fear for the other man, Blair allowed Gordon Brown to become the most powerful Chancellor in British history. It was something Britain's most senior soldier discovered when the spending plan for the military, known as the Strategic Defence Review, came under attack at the 11th hour.
The Strategic Defence Review was enormously important. To my horror, just before it was announced, I was told that the Chancellor wished to remove large chunks of money from our budget, which would have meant the whole Strategic Defence Review would have unravelled. So I spoke to the Prime Minister and said, you know, this was putting me in an extremely difficult position. And he said, will you go and argue with the Chancellor about it? So I said, well, it doesn't, I will go, but it doesn't seem quite right for me to go. I think you should go. I mean, you should tell him what you want because you agree with what we're doing. And he said, well, it's very difficult. You know, it's politics, really. I don't think I can do it. So I said, well, it does seem very wrong, but I have got to do it.
I remember Blair saying to me early on, you know, you just got to get on with your Chancellor. You just, you know, if you look at governments, they fall apart because the Prime Minister and the Chancellor fall out. Whatever happens, I've got to get on with my Chancellor.
Blair's reluctance to confront Brown was to have a momentous impact on one of the Prime Minister's main goals.
It is our destiny to lead in Europe, and Europe needs us. But we have a vision of Europe. We want a people's Europe.
Blair was instinctively pro-European. Joining the single European currency was central to his vision of a modern, outward-looking Britain.
He was pretty keen to take Britain to a referendum and take us into the euro at that stage. Now, unfortunately, every time they tried to do so, they got sort of clobbered by Gordon Brown and the Treasury for stepping out of line. And Gordon argued on economic grounds that we weren't ready for that. But I always felt that quite a large part of his argument was that he'd actually made up his mind for whatever reason that it wasn't going to happen.
Brown insisted that entering the euro was to be subject to 5 economic tests, and he made himself the judge and jury of whether those tests had been passed. Too late, Blair realised he'd given Brown a veto.
He should have had the referendum right at the beginning. He should have gone into government and very early on held a referendum on the principle, not on the timing. And I think that if he had won the argument when he was strong enough to do so, he would have been much better off, that he could and should have done that, and it was a mistake not to do so.
If someone said to me, why didn't he do it? I think it was just lack of courage to face up to this decision. I mean, it's very odd. There is an amazing paradox in the Blair personality, which is that on the one hand, he shows almost too much moral purpose and fervor on international affairs, and on the other can be really quite pusillanimous when it comes to taking decisions on domestic ones. Time and again, issues that he should have confronted early on, he failed to do so.
Over Europe, Blair had come up against the big, clunking fist of his Chancellor and lost. Now he would try.
Okay, guys, that's an interesting piece. All right, who will start the reaction? Yeah. Hi, guys. Hello.
Hello, Doug.
Yeah, Broja. Hello.
Hello, Doug.
Yeah, Broja.
It appears it went off. Mine went off and just came back.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay. Was that the same for other people?
Yes, Doc.
Oh. Anyway, So now this segment was actually talking about the leadership tussle between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and the way the two of them, had to, kind of struggle or kind of manage their own turf, so to speak. And I was going to ask you, which of our political period do you actually find similar, situation, in our political history? And because most of you maybe didn't actually hear it, maybe you have to actually come in. You remember during Kufuor's first term, the relationship between Kufuor and the current president, Nana Addo. Yeah? Hello?
Yes, Doc.
Yeah. So we all know that, since 1992 or since 1996, the leadership of the NPP had always been, whether, was going to be, Kufuor or Nana Addo. One way or the other, Kufuor actually won the leadership, and there is a talk about...
Tafia's very bad network. I don't know if it's from my end.
Okay. Anyone experiencing the same thing? Guys, are you experiencing?
No, Doc.
No, Doc.
Yeah, can you hear me?
No, it's fine on my end. Yes.
Okay, I think it's better now, Doc.
Okay.
Yeah, it's better now, Doc.
Okay. So we know the history between Kufuor's leadership and our current president's leadership of the NPP, where there is, there's a saying that when Nana Addo had to give in to Kufuor's leadership, there was a common gentleman's agreement, between the two of them, that after Kufuor's leadership, it was going to be immediately passed on to Nana Addo, and Nana Addo would assume, that leadership, which obviously in Kufuor's first term, we saw the relationship that actually kind of occurred between the former President Kufuor and Nana Addo when he was Attorney General, for example. Now, there's a similar situation that actually played out during Tony Blair's and Gordon Brown's era, because Gordon Brown had been seen as the most, forefront, as the most, in fact, the number one to Tony Blair, and Blair himself has seen himself as the second to Gordon Brown all along, until the Labour leader, John Smith, actually died. And then the leadership somehow fell on the laps of Tony Blair. Now, that was not something that Gordon Brown really took it lightly. And because of that, the relationship between the two of them was not so rosy, which means that Tony Blair had to also sort of concede some turf to make sure that Gordon Brown would feel, in control. And so he almost completely, ceded the finance ministry or the office of the exchequer to, Gordon Brown completely, to the extent that if you had the military chief, that even when it came to the military budget, Tony Blair was asking the military chief to actually confront Gordon Brown for demanding a chunk of budget from the military, defense budget, as opposed to him himself confronting, Gordon Brown. So you could see that when it comes to leadership, and that's what we were discussing the other time, coalition of, forces within political parties. You may be leader, but there will be other people who perhaps are much more stronger, or they were somehow the leading forces even before you. And when it happens like that, there's a very tenuous relationship between the two of them. And how to manage that is very, very crucial. And if you don't take care, it affects the very fiber of the political party. And we have seen several examples in our political system. In fact, we saw that between former President Rawlings and Akkar, for example. And then we saw that between former President Kufuor and the current President Nana Addo, for example. When it's assumed that former President Kufuor wanted to bring Alan Kyerematen, for example, to become the next leader, as opposed to Nana Addo assuming that kind of gentleman agreement between him and President Kufuor at the time. So these are some of the tenuous relationships that you could have if some of these internal arrangements are not handled properly. And you may think that, yes, it's democracy, but majority of some of these decisions are also very personal decisions, because people have invested their lives, in some of these institutions. And so they would not take it kindly if you want to subvert their interest. So I'm sure some of these things are actually becoming real to us. They are not, something that are from abstraction. These are real practices or real happenings in even the most advanced democracies. Personal interest is still at play when it comes to political organizations. So we must be very mindful of that. Are you with me? Are you with me?
Yes, Doc.
Yes, Doc. Yes, Doc.
Any comments or contribution to that?
Doc, I want to ask, in your own personal view, the way Tony Blair went about it, was that the best way to handle it, or he could have acted differently? Letting Gordon be and running things the way he wanted. Was that the best way? Just ignoring the issue?
Yeah, I think Tony Blair actually gave Gordon the free hand, but it probably wouldn't have been, he wouldn't have given Gordon the free hand if Gordon wasn't as the strongest character as he was. Usually it is very much the case that you want to take a vice or you want to take a deputy who you can somehow control. And control means that you could actually, command and say, I want you to do A, B, C, D. But when the character is so much above you, and I think, from the NDC perspective as well, we once had some of the reasons why, for example, John Mahama did not want to take, Spio Gabra as a vice candidate. We don't know how far it's true. I don't know how far it's true. But, the evidence was clear that having served under, Spio Gabra in the Ministry of Information as a deputy to Spio Gabra, surely the character and the persona of Spio Gabra was over and above perhaps, John Mahama's character at the time. And so it would be a very little uncomforting, seeming to instruct someone who had previously been your leader, for example. And this is the scenario that played out, within Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's leadership, because Gordon Brown has been within the Labour Party seen as the most intelligent and then the most strategic amongst the three of them. Now, when John Smith died, the leadership fell on Tony Blair's laps. Now, surely, Gordon Brown was not going to take it lightly. So the best Tony Blair could do was to allow him to actually control his turf and to feel that he is also in absolute control and not under any dictatorship of Tony Blair. And I think that was the best way he could actually manage the situation, in order that he didn't actually destabilize the machine, if you understand what I mean. So I think that was the best way of doing it.
Okay, Doc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay.
Hello, Doc.
Yeah.
But Doc, as a political strategist, and per the explanation that you've offered, taking the British situation for example where Tony Brown, where Tony Blair did not see Gordon Brown as the best, getting closer to him because of the turf war amongst them. And then you just cited an example of the story once shared about John Mahama and then Ekotio Gabra. But as a political strategist, where you observe that the pair could be the best going forward or going into an election, what do you advise?
Of course, the best is for you to be able to get the two to sit down and talk things over as mature men. Because if the ticket is what would win the election, why not? And for me, as I said, it was a hearsay. Maybe Bruja can actually add something to us as we're just discussing, as in a class. I mean, I'm sure that if that was the case, of course, what do you call, Spigabra would have actually lost as well. So you rather want to play the strong character, personality, and not to be in government, or you want to, play that, yes, I can still play, as your deputy, even though I've been your boss before, and still be in government. I mean, you rather want that maturity to prevail and make sure that you win the ticket. So for me, it is always about how do we win the ticket, not necessarily about egos and who had been the smartest or who had been the head before. I think it's all about, the winning the ticket. I mean, if you look at President Rawlings and Akkad, for example, it was completely the case of ego. Akkad thought that he is, this educated man from, is it Harvard? He's a lawyer, he is this, he is that. And so he could rub shoulders. But of course, President Rawlings was the president. I mean, he's been in government for all these while. He's not going to bring you into the administration for you to become this kind of all-knowing person, for him to sit under. It won't work. Do you get it? So sometimes for the betterment of the party and for the betterment of the ticket, you want to actually, swallow your pride and swallow your ego and make sure that the ticket works. I think that's what actually makes it better.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other point? Any other point? Questions or contribution? Any other questions? All right. Okay, so we'll continue the video. Okay. Again, we have about 8 minutes. When it goes off, we'll set it up again.
New strategy.
It was when we were on the trip to West Africa, he asked me to say to Gordon that if he'd let him join the Euro, he'd give him the country to run, which is an extraordinary and disgraceful offer to make, but there's no doubt he made it. There's no question about it. I think Tony is very much a fly by the seat of the pants man, and at that stage he was absolutely dedicated to getting into the Euro.
Did you take that offer to Gordon, and how did he react?
Yeah, I said to Tony at the end, we'd had meal on the plane, and I said, if you ever want me to talk to Gordon, and he said, I do, I do. So I rang Gordon. We met for lunch, and I told him, and he said, you're not the only one. This message has been sent by others, and you can't arrange politics like that. It's improper. And anyway, he breaks his word.
Blair would sometimes refer to his relationship with Gordon Brown as a marriage, but from the Chancellor's point of view, there were 3 of them in that marriage. Brown would displace much of his resentment towards Blair onto the third side of the new Labour triangle, Peter Mandelson.
In the time when Tony was a young MP, Peter Mandelson was the great thing. He was the man who made Kinnock, and Tony admired him for that. When Tony wanted someone to be that kind of fixer and thinker for him, it was a fascinating combination. And Mandelson had an almost homoerotic admiration for him. I mean, when he was trying to get Hartlepool, the seat, he would stay in Sedgefield with the Blairs. I remember the one period we were there, and it was almost embarrassing the terms in which Peter spoke to me about Tony.
The intensity of the bond between Mandelson and Blair was matched by the loathing and paranoia between Mandelson and Brown.
It was awful. Between the two of them, utterly destructive. And the most poisonous sentiment of all, distrust. And it never recovered.
Just before Christmas 1998, it was revealed that Mandelson had taken a secret home loan from the Paymaster General, Geoffrey Robinson. That explosive information was leaked to the press by the Brown camp. New Labour not only lived by spin, now they were killing each other by spin. Less than a year later, Blair tried to purge his guilt over sacking his old friend by bringing him back into the cabinet, only for Mandelson to be embroiled in another inferno, the Hindager passport affair.
The impression had been given that he'd not been telling the truth. The Prime Minister had judged that answers he had given did not quite fit with the facts. We were going to be placed in a difficulty as a government because, shall we, to put it delicately, there were two stories here.
A subsequent inquiry would find Mandelson innocent of wrongdoing. The Prime Minister was advised by his Cabinet Secretary that Mandelson did not need to resign. A confident Mandelson arrived at number 10 for a meeting with the Prime Minister.
When did it become apparent to you that it was all slipping away from you?
I had no idea that it was slipping away from me until I arrived in Downing Street on the Wednesday morning and sat down in his room.
On that morning, how did he justify what he was doing?
I think these things are best left. They're best left. Whether I will ever choose to write about them or speak about them, I don't know, but I don't think now is the time to do so.
What did you say to him?
I said, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I think I said something like, are you honestly telling me that on the basis of, a couple of headlines in a few newspapers and a story that isn't even prominently leading the news today in the media, you're going to end my political career for the sake of this? And he said, yes, I'm afraid I am.
I saw at first hand the way that Peter was treated in his second dismissal, and it was one of the most brutal things that I've ever seen. Greene once said that a successful writer had to have a splinter of ice in his heart. And I think the same probably goes for prime ministers. And I think that Tony Blair does have a splinter of ice in his heart.
When he first became leader, the Tories characterised him as Bambi. The idea that he would never be able to take any tough decisions and he was just all fluff. I think that the fact that he was able to sack Peter Mandelson twice is evidence that he is incredibly unsentimental. And he just does what he thinks needs to be done.
Blair's allies complained to him.
Okay. Yes, reaction, please. One of the vital points that you could figure out when it comes to the leadership character is from this particular segment. Any reaction? Any reaction, please? Yes? Okay, so you realize that the last comment, the gentleman said when Tony Blair assumed power, the Conservatives actually nicknamed him the Bambi. Bambi meaning that he's a very fluffy person, someone who couldn't actually take any tough decisions. Now, here is Tony Blair actually doing away with Peter Mandelson, one of the architects of New Labour, someone that had actually been there right from the beginning, 83, and him, Tony Blair himself, had actually been looking up to Peter Mandelson. In fact, if you read the story about the New Labour, it's about Mandelson, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, and later years in Alistair Campbell. Now, for him to be able to sack Mandelson, and from Mandelson's own words, he says, so are you going to end my political career because of this? And he says, Tony Blair watched his face and he says, yes. Now, if you're not able to take critical decisions just like that, as a political leader, your image is finished. And we have seen examples in our political system, how people have expended their hard-earned reputation just because they haven't actually taken some decisions that the public actually expects them to take. So if you want to look at the candidate characteristics, one of them is whether the candidate can be very decisive